In 105 BCE, one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled marched north out of Italy and into the Rhone Valley. Two consuls marched at the head of an enormous force of 80,000 legionaries and 40,000 auxiliaries and camp followers. Their purpose was to rid the Roman provinces in what is today the south of France of the Celtic and Germanic peoples who had invaded the region, migrating hordes of disparate peoples who had come from the north to threaten Rome's border provinces. Although they had already gotten the better of a smaller Roman force, the barbarians now faced the full strength of the Roman Republic, the legions who had brutally forged the largest empire in the world in a furnace of steel and blood. The Carthaginians, the descendants of Alexander the Great, and the fierce Gallic people that had once laid waste to Italy, had all been humbled by the Roman military machine. Over the course of 400 years, the Romans had refined their technologies, strategies, and ethos to create the most terrifyingly efficient force of killers that the world had yet seen. Spain to Turkey was theirs, millions killed and enslaved. 100 proud peoples with thousands of years of history had been reduced to subjects of Rome, and almost all of it had been achieved at the point of a legionary's gladius. And now that machine, that unbeatable Roman army, was turned north to face a desperate and loosely united band of migrating barbarians. One force was experienced, battle-tested, and had the full power of an empire behind it. The other appeared poorly organized, desperate, and in unfamiliar territory. The battle that ensued would be brief and decisive. The Romans were beaten. In fact, not just beaten, but annihilated. Their army was routed and their camp overrun. Romans in their heavy armour drowned as they attempted to flee across the Rhone River. The Roman historian Livy tells us that almost nobody got out. 80,000 legionaries and 40,000 auxiliaries and support troops died in the slaughter at Aurasio. Nothing stood between hundreds of thousands of barbarians and the home province of Italy. This was the third, and by far the largest disaster to befall a Roman army north of the Alps in the last few years. It marked the nadir of a dark period for the Roman legionary. The army that had conquered most of the known world was wavering. A degenerative sickness lay at the heart of the Roman military system, weakening it. Somehow, the invincible legions had lost their edge, and it would take a new man with new ideas to fix them.
Hello all! Today we're going to be talking about the Roman Republican Army, how it operated, its strengths, its weaknesses, and how one individual changed it forever. So, get comfy in your armchairs, get ready to see lots of coloured squares move around on maps, and also lots of footage from my most recent Rome Total War campaign, because today we are doing military history. So one of the main things that comes to mind when people think of the iconic Roman legions is their professionalism. You know, paid, lifelong soldiers who spent all of their time preparing for combat. But that is not the case for a fair portion of Rome's early history. During the early Republican era, Rome's army was basically a citizen militia. Romans in the Republic did not fight for pay. They fought out of civic duty. It was part of being a citizen that you would go and fight. The ranks of the legions were filled with regular dudes, you know, farmers, artisans, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, those kinds of guys who in times of war would grab their armour and equip themselves, head down to the Campus Martius, join their fellow citizens, and transform into legionaries. And when I say regular dudes, I mean propertied men. There was a certain wealth requirement that you had to meet if you wanted to have the honour of serving in the legions and protecting your state. This was a fairly standard way of thinking across a great deal of the Mediterranean, where there was a general feeling that the military class should also be the main political class, that those who did the most to fight to defend the state should also have the largest say in how it was governed. And so it was the propertied citizen class that made up the legions of Rome. And how much money they had often dictated what role they would play in battle. If you couldn't afford the full get-up of, you know, nice helmet, shield, bronze breastplate, sword, the whole lot, you might fight as one of the velites, where all you needed was a small shield and to show up on the day of battle with your pointiest stick, where you would screen the movement of the army, do a bit of skirmishing, throw pointy things at each other, but get well out of the way before the main battle started. And if you had a lot of money, you might even be able to afford to bring a horse with you to battle. Although not many did this, the Republican Romans never really got the hang of being cavalrymen. But most Roman soldiers would fight on foot as heavy infantry in the legions. Legions being a division of 4,000 to 5,000 men, then subdivided into 30 maniples, until it looked something like this.
Now, for the benefit of those of you who haven't played Rome Total War, here at the front, those are the velites, the skirmishers with javelins, who were light enough on their feet to throw their missiles, and then get out of there before the hand-to-hand combat began. Behind this screen of skirmishers are the first line of regular infantry, the Hastati. These are the youngest of the legionaries, men just old enough to qualify for service. Behind them are the real core of the army, the Principes, heavily armoured older warriors, usually veterans of previous campaigns, that now act as the main reserves. And behind them, the last resort, the Triarii, the oldest warriors in the army, heavy spearmen who fought in an inflexible but impenetrable phalanx formation. This meant that they would lock shields and point all of their long spears towards the enemy. Not very tactically viable, phalanxes are rigid and vulnerable, but the Triarii weren't like the rest of the army. For most battles, they just hung around in the rear, dossing about whilst the first two ranks did all of the work. They were the last line of defense. There was an old Roman saying that goes, res ad triarios venit, which means, so it comes down to the Triarii, meaning a close struggle that goes on till the bitter end.
So this is our Republican Roman army. Not bad, hey? I mean, look at those cheeky little buggers. They look primed and ready to go out a-conquering. But what else made the Roman legions so unstoppable? I mean, in less than 200 years, they conquered all of this. I mean, it takes more than a few well-placed javelins to create an empire like that. Well, one of the reasons is that the Roman army was ever adapting and changing to face new situations. The description of the Roman army and how it looked that I've just given to you, and the one most familiar to us when we think of the Republican Roman army, is the one described by Polybius, the late 2nd century BCE army, which was already the product of centuries of change. You can see this in their equipment. A great deal of what a late 2nd century Roman legionary took into battle with him was something that his ancestors had appropriated from their enemies. Is your old-fashioned helmet rubbish? Well, never fear. The Gauls are here, who you should fear, but when you're done fearing them, why not take their helmet design and improve it? Are your clumsy spearmen having a hard time subduing those Spanish Celts armed with that, what's it called, the little stubby stabbing thing, a gladius, is that it? Well, those look good. Why not unironically make thousands of them and distribute them to all of the Roman soldiers? And the legions were just like, alright, I guess I'm a swordsman now. I suppose I'll just throw my spear at the beginning of the battle then. Here's another example of just how adaptable the Romans could be. In the 3rd century BCE, they got themselves embroiled in a multi-generational series of conflicts with the Empire of Carthage, the largest maritime power in the Mediterranean. Look at all this water separating Rome and Carthage, okay? So a war between the two is going to involve crossing the sea at some point. And the Carthaginians have the biggest navy in the world, and the Romans aren't a seafaring people. But they are almost psychotically undaunted by the prospect of becoming one. So when a Carthaginian vessel washed up on their shores, they simply copied it and made their own. Now, this didn't fully work. Being a Roman sailor in the First Punic War came with a life expectancy of basically until the next storm, and the Carthaginians were still the better sailors. So the Romans, innovative as they were, simply attached a massive bridge to the front of their ships and turned naval battles into land battles, which they were better at. Did that work? Sort of, kind of, not really. The point is that the Romans won the First Punic War, and one of the main reasons they did was because they were so willing to adapt and change the way they did things to face new challenges. However, the Romans couldn't innovate their way out of every crisis. No people can. Sometimes the change required to solve a problem or to face a new challenge is simply too great for a single people to undertake quickly. But never to fear, the Romans have a solution for that as well. If ever there was a combat role that they simply could not adapt to, they would just hire someone else to do it for them. A great example of this can be found in the Second Punic War, which is a huge conflict that basically defined Roman history for the next 100 years. In the last 2 decades of the 3rd century BCE, a Carthaginian general called Hannibal Barca marched an army of elephants and Spanish mercenaries over the Alps and into Italy, in what was undoubtedly one of the greatest pro-gamer moves in all of history. He proceeded to comprehensively destroy 3 Roman armies and threaten the city of Rome itself. Also, quick side note, Hannibal crossing the Alps is, to Roman history, kind of what Smells Like Teen Spirit is to grunge music. It's huge, everyone's heard of it, it's probably what got most people into it to begin with, and as a result, everyone is sick of hearing about it. But us hardcore fans have to remember and give some allowance to the fact that there is a good reason why even the normies have heard about it, and that's because it objectively rocks. You know, some North African general just marched elephants and an army of mercenaries over the largest mountain range in Europe, and then destroyed armies twice the size of his, using some of the most mind-bendingly clever tactics in all of history. That is nuts. However, as cool as the idea of elephants crossing the Alps and then trampling Romans is, it doesn't seem like they had too much of an actual impact on the outcome of the war. As far as we can tell, they were basically all dead by the end of the first winter. Rest in peace, an entire species of elephant. Hannibal's real advantage, his secret weapon in destroying these enormous Roman armies, came from his cavalry, from his Numidian horsemen. Numidia is here, roughly modern Algeria. They were semi-nomadic people who lived in the Atlas Mountains, and they had a king, and the king of Numidia would regularly provide soldiers for his allies, the Carthaginians. And these guys were just unstoppable. You know, they rode without saddle, they rode without bridle, and unless you had been riding a horse your entire life, you couldn't outride a Numidian. No matter how outnumbered he was, no matter how much the odds were stacked against him, Hannibal could always rely on the fact that his Numidian cavalry would run circles around the inferior Roman horsemen. The Roman general, Scipio Africanus, couldn't beat them. So he didn't. He just encouraged the king of Numidia to switch sides, which eventually they did. In the final battle of the Second Punic War, the Battle of Zama, the Numidians fought on the Roman side, and they defeated Hannibal. Sure, the Romans were great infantrymen. The Roman legionary with his great big shield and his short stabbing sword was basically as good as it got. But when it came to cavalrymen, archers, or specialized infantry, the Romans knew that there were some people that they were just never going to beat. So they didn't try. Instead, they hired them and incorporated them into their own army. And this meant that the Roman army of the late Republic was multicultural and multi-talented. There was one more advantage that the Romans had on their side, and that was the value that their society placed on martial skill. If you wanted to become a politician in the Roman Republic, you had to get your start in the military. There was no civilian route to power. And if you already were a successful Roman politician, well, there was no honor as great as being proclaimed Imperator, which was a title bestowed upon a successful general by his troops. Foreshadowing time, Imperator is where we get our modern word emperor from. But we'll talk more about how the Roman army would contribute to the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the emperors in the next video. Being proclaimed Imperator was the first step towards a triumph, a huge city-wide parade held in honor of a victorious commander. And all of that was great political ammunition. Pretty much anyone described as the greatest Roman of their day earned that honorific through military conquest or through defending the city. Romans would seek to become successful in politics so that they could get desirable military commands, and they would seek to gain glory in war so they could further their political career. Politics and the military were totally intertwined. The leaders of civilian life, the leading magistrates, were also the leading generals in the army, and the leading generals in the army were usually only in that position because they were also the leading magistrates. Hence why pretty much all of the great figures of the Roman Republic, Cicero excluded, were also great generals. And the desire to be militarily victorious, due to the social status and the political agency it would give you, led to Rome being a very warlike place. especially when you consider that the leading magistrates, the people who got the glory of warfare, usually only served for a single year. That's 1 year in office in which a Roman would have to do something worth recording in the annals of military history. That's not a long time to get your glory. And sometimes this led to mistakes. When Hannibal crossed the Alps, the Roman army was in a complete shambles. One of the consuls was incapacitated, and the other one was in a cold winter camp waiting to do battle with the Carthaginians. The motivation for fighting Hannibal was, according to Livy, more to do with the consul's personal ambition than sound strategy. Elections were just around the corner. The consuls were going to be replaced soon. Besides, only one of them was fit for duty. If he went out and beat Hannibal now, he would get all of the glory for himself and become the greatest Roman of his day. Hannibal knew this, and he used it to draw the over-eager Roman commander into a trap and defeat him. So that's an example of it going wrong for the Romans. But most of the time, the Romans won. The effect of having consuls only serve for 1 year in office and putting a lot of pressure on them to do something worth noting in that time meant that Rome was basically always at war. For the 2nd century BCE, they are almost constantly invading somewhere. There's always another people just over the horizon in need of conquering, and there's always someone in Rome desperate to be the guy that does it. So there we have it. My personal reasons for why the Roman army was just so damn good. They weren't shy about adapting or changing to meet new challenges. They had no qualms about incorporating foreign or conquered peoples or their ideas into their military system, and their politics and society encouraged an aggressive, martial culture in which the greatest honor that you could ever earn in life could only be gained through victory in war. These factors combined to create an army that swept aside all of the pre-existing powers of the Mediterranean and carved Rome out an empire. But they weren't perfect. In fact, every time the Roman army changed in order to solve an old problem, they created a new one. And by the end of the 2nd century BCE, the cracks were really starting to show. As we've established, the 2nd century BCE was a particularly violent time to be a Roman. Wars of conquest and subjugation were more or less constant, and towards the end of the century, 2 conflicts in particular began revealing the weaknesses of the Roman military. First was a war in Spain against a Celtic tribe called the Numantines. I've already done a video that kind of covers this, but in short, the Numantine War was a long, unpopular, and inglorious mess for the Romans. They spent over a decade slogging it out in the mountainous interior of central Spain, with a tribe of people that didn't really have the wealth or power to make the war seem, worth it. As well as the unwelcome taste of defeats and setbacks, the Numantine War also revealed to the Romans the flaws of their military system in the way that it was integrated with their greater society and their political life. As we've already discussed, the Roman army of this era is like a citizen militia. Propertied men would equip themselves out of their own pocket, head to the field of Mars, and defend their city. And when the war was over, they would return to their homes, farms, and businesses and resume civilian life. But the days of actually defending Rome were kind of over. The city-state had expanded from a regional Italian power into a massive empire over the course of a century, and this put huge strain on the Roman recruitment system. In the good old days of regional Italian wars, Roman men were expected to be away at war for a campaigning season, a few months out of the year at most. But the war in Spain required them to spend years away from their families in the provinces, meaning that when they returned home from the war, they usually found that their families were poor and their businesses destitute. Despite being styled masters of the world, an increasing number of Romans were becoming impoverished. And remember that it was the propertied class that made up the core of the Roman army. As that class shrank, so too did the pool of potential recruits. Dad was too busy fighting a war to provide for his children, so unlike him, they won't ever qualify for military service. As the empire grew, so did Rome's manpower shortage. As all of this was happening, a young politician by the name of Tiberius Gracchus was whipping up the disenfranchised families of veterans into a frenzy by questioning the tenets of Rome's martial culture. He pointed out that Roman commanders were always telling their men to fight for hearth, shrines and country, fight so that the Romans can be masters of the world. But ironically, the men doing the fighting were left only poorer for it. These were the weaknesses exposed by the Numantine War. Rome's citizen militia could not cope with the manpower demands of a massive empire, and the soldiers were just not motivated to fight wars that made others richer and themselves poorer. Confidence in the Roman legions only decreased further in the next war, which broke out in 112 BCE. Remember the Numidians, those really good cavalry who used to fight against Rome with the Carthaginians, but then switched sides and joined the Romans? Well, they're still about, and for the last 100 years they've been a really staunch ally of the Romans. Well, the death of the king of Numidia had thrown his country into chaos as his sons and successors fought over who would get to be the next king. And in one incident, a couple of Romans are killed by the forces of one Jugurtha, who was one of these would-be kings. And this eventually leads to an all-out war between Jugurtha and the Romans. I'll keep this short, but the ensuing war is an utter embarrassment for the Romans, not only because they suffer defeats, but because of how they are defeated. Jugurtha is credited as saying about the city of Rome that it was a city up for sale and doomed if it should find a buyer. And this perfectly sums up his methods for fighting the Romans. Jugurtha was obscenely rich, so he just bribed his way out of everything. He'd actually fought with the Romans as an auxiliary during the Numantine War, and had seen firsthand how poorly motivated the Roman soldiers were. So he quickly realised that a quick bribe here and a bit of money under the table there would see his prisoners returned to him, or the Romans call off an attack at the last minute, or even sometimes see the Romans attack their own allies instead of him. The Jugurthine War dragged on and on for years as a result of this corruption that had seeped deep into the core of the Roman army. Even the generals who wouldn't take bribes couldn't bring Jugurtha to justice. To solve this problem, Rome would need a new type of hero, a new man, a down-to-earth problem solver, a no-nonsense pragmatist. A guy like Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius. Here we go. Gaius Marius was a new man, both literally in that he was new on the scene, part of a new generation of Romans who had grown up in the shadow of the Numantine War, and in that he was a novus homo, which is a word that the Romans used to mean someone whose family was obscure and had never held political office before. Marius was born in the small town of Arpinum, not in Rome. He was an Italian, not a Roman. Had he been born 30 years prior, he wouldn't have even been a proper citizen. He was also born the son of a wealthy equestrian. Although later stories would style Marius as coming from very humble origins, he probably grew up with quite a bit of privilege and money. But these stories of an impoverished childhood didn't come from nowhere. Marius did not descend from a line of inbred aristocrats like most Roman politicians did. He was much more a man of the people. We'll get into Marius's political career much more in the next video, but in short, he was not only a populist, but a bit of a radical. He had no time or patience for tradition or custom if he felt that it was getting in the way of him just getting the job done. And he was a really good soldier. He fought in the Numantine Wars under the general Scipio Aemilianus, who apparently was instantly impressed by Marius. There's a story of a time when Scipio is having dinner with his sycophantic underlings, and they're flattering him and saying things like, "Oh, Scipio, you're just the best general ever. How are we ever going to replace you when you're gone? Oh, Rome will never know anyone as great as you." And Scipio responds by putting a hand on Marius's shoulder and saying, "Perhaps this is my replacement here." And this story is not impossible to believe, because Marius was very clearly a born leader, which is why in 107 BCE he was elected consul and tasked with bringing Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, to justice. And to do that, he would need a new type of army, and we see straight away the kind of pragmatic, no-nonsense guy that Marius was. It was custom that the honour of serving as a Roman legionary was reserved for men of a certain class. There was a wealth requirement that you had to meet to get into the legions, and you had to provide all of your own gear, your own shield, your own helmet, things like that. So naturally it was only men who had a certain level of wealth who could do it. But Marius had no time for that. You know, he wanted effective soldiers who could win battles, and he wanted plenty of them. And so Marius got around Rome's manpower shortage by just completely disregarding this rule and enlisting the unpropertied, poor and disenfranchised. This was one of the first really big changes he made to the Roman military. No longer would it be a citizen militia made up of people conscripted from a certain class of Romans on the idea that they were doing their civic duty. No, now it would be volunteers. Volunteers largely from the poorer elements of society and from the Italian allies who didn't have the same enfranchisement as the Romans. And they fought for pay, plunder, and victory. And so Marius took his new army and marched into Numidia to get the King Jugurtha and bring victory to Rome. And when he got there, he immediately encountered massive difficulties. Jugurtha could no longer bribe his way to victory, or at least out of defeat, but he could start an unconventional guerrilla war which the Roman army was completely unsuited to fighting. But eventually, after months of chasing him through the Atlas Mountains all the way into modern Morocco, Marius captures the renegade king. Sort of. Marius commands the army that captures Jugurtha, but he doesn't actually get his hands on him himself. The guy responsible for capturing the king was actually a cavalry commander by the name of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Keep an eye on him, he's going to be really important later. By later, I mean in like the next video I do. I'm not going to be able to get to Sulla this time round, sorry. Jugurtha was beaten, and one of the most disheartening and grueling conflicts of the 2nd century had been brought to a victorious conclusion, and Marius was the #1 guy. He marched back through Rome with Jugurtha in chains, much to the chagrin of the aristocrats, who all sneered and went, "Oh, well, he's not as aristocratic and blue-blooded as me. Can he trace his relatives to the founders of Rome? I don't think so." And to be fair, Marius was not at all shy about rubbing salt in the wound. He loved going on about how he, a simple soldier, a humble man of provincial Italian origins, had succeeded so easily where all these effeminate and corrupt nobles had failed. Gaius Marius had also earned himself a reputation as a guy who could just get stuff done. The perfect leader for a crisis, an innovative mind who disregarded tradition and was purely pragmatic about how to solve problems. And that was just as well, because a huge, far greater threat than Numidia loomed over Rome's northern borders.
So here's something from history that we don't really have to deal with anymore. The possibility of entire peoples who we've never heard of just appearing out of the blue. It used to happen all the time. You'd just be peacefully living life as a pre-modern person, and a totally new group of human beings would appear out of nowhere and fuck things up. Imagine the sheer shock of being a Meso-American in the 15th century, just minding your own business when suddenly a bunch of dudes in shiny clothes riding giant deer and firing boomsticks just appear on boats and turn your world upside down with gunpowder and smallpox. Today we have satellite imagery and a pretty good idea of what the 7 billion people on our planet are all about. When we find a new people, as it were, they tend to come from somewhere inaccessible, and there usually aren't that many of them. Not so in the ancient world. The Romans of the late 2nd century BCE, for example, had very little idea of what was going on only a few hundred miles north of their territory. For all they know, here be dragons, and griffins, and 8-legged dolphins that walk on land and live underground or something. And sometimes, entire groups of migrating people would just arrive on their doorstep. And it's exactly what happened to the Romans at the end of the 2nd century BCE. Two enormous tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones, descended on Roman Gaul from the frozen north. Who exactly the Cimbri and the Teutones were is a mystery to us, and it was a bit of a mystery to the Romans as well. They appear to have come from northern Europe, possibly modern Scandinavia, and migrated south.
being of mixed Germanic and Celtic origin, and along the way they picked up a bunch of other peoples to join their growing coalition. And by the time they reached the periphery of the Roman world, they numbered 300,000 fighting men and even more women, children, and other camp followers. That is, if Plutarch is to be believed, which, well, we have no archaeological evidence for this migration, so we kind of have to rely on him as a written source. So, yeah, 300,000. What we can say for certain is that they scared the living daylights out of the Romans. The Germanic peoples are described as being taller and fiercer than the Romans of this era, and their language had this harsh, unpleasant sound to it, to the Roman ears at least, that really frightened them. On top of that, they had a bit of a habit, apparently, of sacrificing their prisoners of war. The Roman geographer Strabo tells us,
writers report a custom at the Cimbri to this effect. Their wives, who would accompany them on their expeditions, were attended by priestesses who were seers. These were grey-haired, clad in white with flaxen cloaks, fastened on with clasps, girt with girdles of bronze and barefooted. Now, sword in hand, these priestesses would meet with the prisoners of war throughout the camp, and having first crowned them with wreaths, they would lead them to a brazen vessel of about 20 amphorae, and they had a raised platform which the priestesses would mount, and then, bending over the kettle, would cut the throat of each prisoner after he had been lifted up. And from the blood that poured forth into the vessel, some of the priestesses would draw a prophecy, while still others would split open the body and from an inspection of the entrails would utter a prophecy of victory for their own people. And during the battles they would beat on the hides that were stretched over the wicker bodies of the wagons, and in this way produce an unearthly noise.
Frightening stuff, but what was even scarier is that the Romans seemed completely incapable of stopping them. Multiple Roman armies had marched north to meet this new threat, and all of them had been annihilated. In the worst case scenario, the one that we started this video with, the Battle of Aurasio, up to 120,000 people were killed. And this disaster had thrown the Romans into a complete panic. You know, they had nothing left between them and the barbarian horde. There was no longer an army to protect them. They only had the Alps, which the Cimbri and the Teutones need only cross, and they would have a direct path to the city of Rome, just as the Gauls had done 300 years prior. These peoples could have probably just walked into Italy and taken what they wanted, but luckily they didn't, and it's unclear why, but the Cimbri and the Teutones spend the next few years just kind of dicking around in southern France and Spain, plundering away to their heart's content, I imagine. And this bought the Romans valuable time to prepare, and more importantly, to recall and re-elect Gaius Marius. Fresh off of his victory in Numidia, Marius returns to a city which is desperate for him to resolve this crisis, and so they elect him consul for the second time in a row. This was illegal. It was very illegal, actually. The Romans could only hold a consulship twice in their lives, and they couldn't hold them consecutively. However, recent events had changed the way that the Roman people thought about their constitution and their politics. To start with, there was the factor that I spent over an hour explaining in this video about Tiberius Gracchus, that the traditions that the Romans had held sacred for so many centuries were starting to fall away as the city outgrew a constitution designed to govern a city-state that now had to govern a massive empire. But secondly, and more importantly in this case, Marius represented a break from Rome's traditional elite. At the Battle of Aurasio, there had been two Roman commanders. One of them was called Caepio, a true aristocrat, a blue-blooded patrician whose family had served Rome for generations. And another, a man called Maximus, who, like Gaius Marius, was a novos homo, a new man, a person from relatively humble origins who was the first in their family to hold political office. And this caused friction in the Roman command. The blue-blooded Caepio refused to acknowledge that he was the equal in authority to this man who was so much less noble than he. And so effectively, even though there was this huge Roman army at the Battle of Aurasio, it was acting like two separate, smaller armies. When he spotted the enemy, Caepio hated the idea that he would have to share the command and therefore the glory and the credit with this new man. So without warning his colleague, he attacked the Teutones and the Cimbris and was defeated. And the barbarians were like, great, we thought we'd have to face this huge Roman army. Turns out we can split them into small armies and defeat them one at a time. Easy peasy, continue to squeeze lemons. This avoidable catastrophe, combined with the incompetency of Marius's noble predecessors in the Jugurthine War, kind of turned the electorate off of the nobility. You know, they'd seen Gaius Marius, a man from relatively humble origins who lacked the breeding and the education of his colleagues. They'd seen him cut through the bullshit. They'd seen him deliver victory after victory, no matter what people said about him, where these blue-blooded aristocrats had only delivered embarrassing defeat. Plutarch tells us,
Soon, however, all this envy and hatred and slander of Marius was removed and dissipated by the peril which threatened Italy from the west. As soon as the state felt the need of a great general, and looked about for a helmsman whom she might employ to save her from so great a deluge of war, then the people would have nothing to do with anyone of high birth or of wealthy house who offered himself at the consular elections, but proclaimed Marius consul.
Now this is not without precedent. The Romans had ignored the law in times of crisis before, to allow the obviously best candidate, the best man for the job, to stay in power until the crisis had ironed itself out. But Marius was elected year after year after year, which, well, we'll deal with the consequences of that in the next video. With the time bought for him by his semi-legal consulships, and the fact that the barbarians appear to have lost interest in Italy for the time being, Marius turned to the Roman army and began reforming it to make it more effective. He had already begun the process of doing away with the property requirements that had, in the past, limited the pool of potential Roman manpower. But this appears to be the point where he did away with it altogether. Instead of relying on landed citizens to fill the ranks of his legions, Marius turned to the unlanded in Italy, and the Italian allies who were not yet full citizens. He also set about changing the way in which legions organized themselves. Gone were the days of the Hastati, the Principes, and the Triarii. The old manipular system was out, and a much more condensed and cohesive system of cohorts and centuries came in. Now, it's unclear whether or not this was Marius's idea, or if he was even the guy to implement it. It certainly existed as an idea before Gaius Marius, but it's after this point that this becomes the standard legion, so it's often attributed to Marius. Then came their equipment. A new type of javelin was introduced, which was structurally weaker than the old design. The Roman pilum would bend or break upon impact with something solid, which meant that it couldn't be picked up after being thrown and then thrown back at the Roman lines, and if it hit someone's shield, it would bend in it, making it very difficult to remove. And in ancient warfare, if you don't have a shield, you're going to have a hard time. He also got his soldiers training in physical fitness and independence. He didn't want to rely on long, vulnerable baggage trains to supply his men, nor did he want thousands of camp followers eating up supplies and taking up space. No, from here on out, the Roman legions would carry their own supplies, erect their own camps, and prepare their own food. In order to ensure that this didn't slow them down, Marius really emphasized in the training of his legions physical fitness and endurance. They would march and run for miles a day whilst carrying all of their equipment. And this new emphasis on fitness and engineering led to them being dubbed by some Marius's mules. Now, a name like that suggests that not everyone was happy about this, and you can imagine if you had previously lived as a relatively comfortable legionary, fighting battles, but having your camp made for you, your bed laid for you, and your food prepared for you, it probably came as an unpleasant shock that suddenly you were expected to take on all of these new responsibilities yourself. And Marius probably wouldn't have gotten away with it so easily had he not really conducted himself as one of the boys. You know, he wasn't sitting on his horse watching his men work. He would dive in and dig ditches with them, help them erect their camps, and join them on their exercises. And when he went to bed at night, he slept on a simple wooden board instead of wandering around with an extravagant tent so everyone knew that he was a big, important general. So he was a real soldier's soldier, and a personally charismatic guy. Of that there's no doubt. He has to have been. You know, the fact that he was a novus homo, a man without the aristocratic background and breeding, meant that he could distance himself from the unpopular commanders who had turned so many soldiers against them during the Jugurthine and the Numantine Wars. In fact, Plutarch gives us an example of this. Marius's own nephew served with him in this time as a junior officer, and despite being a good soldier, according to Plutarch, he had a bit of an unfortunate habit of trying to seduce the men under him, and at one point he becomes enamored with this soldier called Trebonius, offering him money and gifts in exchange for a relationship. But Trebonius keeps on turning him down, so eventually Marius's nephew tries to abuse his position of power in the army as this guy's officer, and orders him to come to his tent. And Trebonius, being a good soldier, thinks, well, it's an order from my commanding officer, I best go. But when he goes into the tent, Marius's nephew tries to force himself on Trebonius, a fight breaks out, and Trebonius kills his officer. Marius was apparently away from camp at the time, but he returns to find his nephew dead and the killer on trial, and everyone is very quick to condemn Trebonius. But he defends himself, he stands up and he says, look, this guy propositioned me, I said no, and I refuse, as a good, honourable Roman man, to prostitute myself by offering a relationship in exchange for money and gifts. And to everyone's surprise, Marius not only acquits Trebonius, but he personally bestows upon him the crown of bravery, which is like the ancient Roman version of a medal. He says that Trebonius acted nobly in a time when Rome was in need of examples of noble conduct. Plutarch relates this story to us at length because he uses it as an example of why Marius was so popular with his men, because he was considered just, fair, and upright in his decision-making. Anyways, after 2 years of preparation, training, and reforms, Marius now has an army that he is confident can face and defeat the Cimbri and the Teutones, which is just as well because the barbarians had turned away from Spain and were heading back towards Italy.
Marius marched north and the tribes marched east until they finally met at the Rhone River. But Marius did not attack. Instead, he simply set up camp on his side of the river and stayed put. The Teutones and the Cimbri saw Marius's army and decided that they ought to split up. The Teutones would stay here and keep Marius pinned down, while the Cimbri marched further east and crossed the Alps behind him. But Marius remained where he was, making his camp more and more formidable, from which his men spent days simply watching the Teutones.
Plutarch tells us that there was a method to Marius's madness. His inaction had a psychological impact on his men. Remember that these barbarians had wiped out every Roman army that had stood in their path, and on top of that, the sheer size and foreignness of the Germanic and Celtic peoples terrified Romans. One of the major stereotypes of northern barbarians at this time is their size in comparison to the Romans. You know, they are taller and fiercer and stronger. Plutarch tells us,
their numbers were limitless, they were hideous in their aspect, and their speech and cries were unlike those of other peoples.
But by having his men stay put and just observe the Teutones, Marius conditioned his men to the sight of the horde, until eventually they were undaunted by the sheer unfamiliarity of them. The Teutones, who eventually began just bypassing Marius on their way to Italy, would make chilling threats. When they were in earshot of the Roman soldiers, they would yell, "What messages have you for your wives? For we will be seeing them shortly," which was a terrifying reminder to the Romans of the consequences of defeat, that Rome would be sacked, and their families would either be killed or enslaved. And so the soldiers became increasingly agitated and began to turn on Marius, accusing him of cowardice, of caging them away. Why won't he let us just get out there and kill this tenacious enemy? And Marius was delighted to hear this. It was exactly what he'd planned. Exposure to the Teutones had desensitized his men to the fear that they had once felt and enraged them. The panic and the terror that had gripped the Roman people after the disaster at Aurasio had transformed into anger and determination. When his army faced the barbarians, they wouldn't turn and run. So for a little while, Marius tails the Teutones, always keeping a safe distance but never letting them out of sight. One day, the Romans have set up camp on a hill, and the Teutones are setting up their camp by a river. And Marius's soldiers come to him, and they inform him that the army is running low on its supply of water. And Marius simply points at the river under the control of the enemy and says, "There you may find water, if you will pay the price in blood." which is an astoundingly cool line. I'm sure everyone who heard it knew what it meant. It meant battle was finally going to be joined. But the kind of 80s action movie awesomeness of it is only slightly undercut by the fact that the ensuing battle would be a disorganized mess. Although it seemed like Marius was telling his men to fight for water, he didn't send them out straight away. He wanted to establish a camp first, somewhere safe to retreat to, should things not go their way. But a great deal of the thirsty Romans, especially the ones with horses, don't want to wait until all of the trenches are dug and all of the palisades put up before they go to get their drink.
How am I supposed to
defeat a migrating army of Germanic and Celtic peoples and save Roman civilization from annihilation and enslavement?
do without my drink?
So, without permission, they gather what weapons they can find and start sneaking out of camp down towards the river. On the other side of the river, the barbarians have split apart to make their camps. There are tens, potentially hundreds of thousands of them. They can't all camp in one space because they would drink rivers dry and just destroy the local landscape, so they have to camp separately. And the contingent camped nearest to the Roman lines are made up of a Celtic people called the Ambrones, who are one of the many tribes that the Teutones seem to have picked up along their migration. And according to Plutarch, they are feasting, drinking, and bathing when small groups of Romans start appearing on the opposite bank and small-scale fights break out. The brawls and skirmishes on the outskirts of the Ambrones camp over the water supply start to grow and get louder and louder until the majority of Ambrones have clocked on to what's going on and they start running to get their weapons and armor. Marius also hears what's going on, and seeing that whether he likes it or not, battle is now inevitable, he sends a detachment of Ligurian legionaries down to the river. Now, many of the Ambrones are apparently completely drunk, but despite this fact, they manage to maintain order and discipline. They line up with all of their shields and spears pointed towards the enemy, and they chant the name of their tribe, Ambrones, over and over again in unison to create a terrifying war cry. And Marius's legion of Ligurians, even though they're Roman soldiers, are also Celtic peoples. A great deal of northern Italy was Celtic at this time. What's more, the Ligurians believed that they shared a common ancestor with the Ambrones, that they were in a way relative tribes. So when they hear this ferocious Celtic war cry, they simply yell the exact same thing right back. Soon, battle was joined, and it very quickly turned into a pretty one-sided fight. The Ligurians fell on the Ambrones as they tried to cross the river, and drove them into the water, cutting them down as they did so. Split up by the water, and seeing so many of their comrades being killed, the Ambrones attempt to retreat, but the Romans follow. And here's where one of the really tragic elements of this battle takes place. Remember that this confederation of tribes led by the Teutones and the Cimbri wasn't just an army, it was an entire migrating people. So the camp involved not only the Ambrones warriors, but also their wives, their children, the elderly. So when the Romans surrounded the camp and began systematically massacring everyone in it, they killed not only the men, but the women, and the children too.
The Romans kept slaying them until they came in their flight to their camp and wagons. Here the women met them, swords and axes in their hands, and with hideous shrieks of rage tried to drive back the fugitives and pursuers alike. The fugitives as traitors, and the pursuers as foes. They mixed themselves up with the combatants, with bare hands tore away the shields of Romans or grasped their swords, and endured wounds and mutilations, their fierce spirits unvanquished to the end.
Thus, the Ambrones were wiped out, and the Teutones, hearing what's happened to their allies, halt near a place called Aquae Sextiae and allow Marius to catch up. And this had worked out very well for Marius. The Teutones had stopped in a place where he knew he could force the tribes to attack him on unfavourable terrain. So he set up camp at the top of a rocky hill and let his men get a hot meal and a good night's sleep.
Almost all of his men, that is. 3,000 of them covertly left the camp and hid themselves in a different location, where they would remain and wait for the battle to start. In the morning, Marius's army set themselves up at the top of a hill, ready to receive the charge of the Teutones. Now this was the potential breaking point for the Romans. They had handily beaten 30,000 Ambrones, but now a much larger and better prepared force was charging them. The initial attack of these tribes was deeply horrifying. Without fear, the Germans would throw themselves on the Roman lines, battering them with massive axes and huge dividing swords, relying on strength, force of will, and numbers to break through the legion's lines and hack the enemy to pieces.
But Marius calmed his men. He reminded them that the Germans would be unable to use their strength to just batter through the Roman lines because they were attacking uphill over steep and uneven ground. The Romans need only lock their shields, throw their javelins, and prepare to beat the enemy back.
And this is precisely what happened. The Germans' charge was checked by the legions, who began pushing the tribes back down the hill. When the time was ripe, Marius's 3,000 ambush troops broke from their cover and attacked the Teutones from behind. The Teutones panicked. Those in the rear rushed forward, and those in the front pushed back. As this is happening, the methodical Roman killing machine just kept on pushing, stabbing, and slaughtering. Like before, they eventually fell on the wagons and camps of the tribes in an orgy of looting and plunder. Families who were not butchered on the spot were kept to be sold into slavery. The battle was reportedly so bloody that for years the locals would use the bones of the dead to fence their vineyards, and the sheer amount of bodies fertilized the ground, fattening the harvest with the remains of a desolated people.
Thus, Marius was victorious over the invading Teutones. But remember that the migrating horde had split into two to invade Italy from different directions. The Teutones had been defeated trying to get into Italy via the west, but the Cimbri had gone via the northeast. So what about them?
Marius had thought of this, and sent his colleague Quintus Lutatius Catulus to the Alps to block the Cimbri from entering Italy. But Catulus faced a problem. He could either split his force up to guard the Alpine passes, but in doing so turn his big powerful army into smaller weaker ones and risk their individual annihilation, or he could abandon the passes and look for a more suitable defensive spot. He chose the second option, and decided to defend a bridge over the river Atiso. He put his main camp on the south side, but also built a fortification on the north to prevent the Cimbri from crossing. The idea being that he could use the bridge to reinforce the north, if he needed to. But the Cimbri weren't daunted. They began throwing everything they could into the fast-running river. Uprooted trees, mounds of earth, fragments of cliff. These were thrown into the river, carried by the rapids, and smashed into the wooden bridge with tremendous force, threatening to break it and cut one Roman force off from the other. Then the warriors appeared. Despite the snows and cold temperatures, they fought without clothing, putting their giant shields under themselves and sledding down the smooth mountain faces before advancing to the northern Roman defences.
At this point, the thoroughly intimidated Romans began to run away. Catulus saw his plan collapse before his very eyes, and he couldn't prevent his men from fleeing in terror. What he did next would earn him the respect of Plutarch and other patriotic Romans for the rest of time. He ordered that his banner be raised, and then he galloped to the front of his fleeing men. By doing this, he made it look like they weren't just running away in terror, but were actually following their general in an organised retreat, and ensured that all of the shame of what happened that day would fall on his shoulders alone, and not on Rome or her soldiers. Luckily for the Romans, the Cimbri were entirely too preoccupied with plundering the north of Italy to pursue and destroy Catulus's army, and this gave them time to regroup and rejoin with Gaius Marius's forces from the west. Soon, the two armies were facing each other once again, and the Cimbri sent ambassadors to Marius to lay out their demands. They would be so generous as to leave Rome alone on one condition: that the Romans provide them land and cities to live in, and not just land for them, but also for their brethren, the Teutones. Upon hearing this, the Roman officers begin laughing. Clearly the Cimbri haven't heard about what happened at Aquae Sextiae, and are still expecting the Teutones to appear over the Alps any day now. Marius responded by telling the Cimbri not to worry about their brethren the Teutones. They have land that they shall possess for all time, land which the Romans had given them. This sarcasm sent the Cimbri into a fury. They swore that the Romans would pay for their insolence. They'd pay as soon as the Teutones arrived. Marius responds with yet more sarcasm, saying, yes, of course, absolutely. They're here, the Teutones, and you know it would be wrong for you to go back to your camp without first embracing your brethren. He then has the surviving chiefs of the Teutones marched out in chains. With this sudden realization having shaken the Cimbri, one of their kings comes forward and asks Gaius Marius to give them a time and place for battle. Marius obliges, and a bizarre negotiation takes place in which they negotiate the time and place that they will fight. They decide in the end to go with 3 days' time on the plain of Vercellae. Plutarch describes the ensuing battle, which is a little bit of a break from form for him. He doesn't usually describe battles in detail. He's a biographer. He likes to focus on individuals, and he's a philosopher, so he likes to focus on morals as well. But nevertheless, he lets us in on some exciting and weird details about this battle that we might not otherwise pick up on, and help us paint a nice picture of how ancient battles took place. For example, the armies kick up so much dust that when Marius advances to meet the Cimbri, he can't see them, and he completely misses them. He just marches past them, and he has to go up and down his own line several times, actually trying to locate where the enemy are. And the Cimbri, apparently, fasten a chain through the belts of all of their warriors to, bind them together for some reason, maybe to, keep their ranks together or something like that. Not that it matters, the Romans cut through their line like butter. The battle very quickly turns into a very one-sided fight. And as the battle was being won, the Roman legions witness a spectacle that even they considered tragic. And these are the Romans, remember, they're a very hard-hearted people. But as they reach the Cimbric camp, the Romans are forced to watch as the families of the warriors they have just defeated commit a brutal mass suicide. Plutarch describes the various ways that mothers would dispatch children and then themselves to avoid falling alive into enemy hands. And at the end of the carnage, 120 Cimbri were dead and 60,000 were captured to be sold into slavery. And thus the Cimbric War had ended. Rome had been saved, and for the first time in her history, she hadn't been saved by the propertied class of land-holding Roman citizens, but by the urban poor and Italian allies, people who had turned to Gaius Marius specifically and fought for him. They did this on the understanding that Gaius Marius would also fight for them, which he immediately obliged them in. And as soon as the battle was over, anyone in his army who wasn't already a Roman citizen was granted citizenship by him personally, which he did not have the power to do. Only the Senate had the power to bestow citizenship upon someone. But Marius had broken the law before. He'd broken the law to be a consul 5 times in a row, and he'd break the law again to reward his veterans. When challenged on this, Marius had sarcastically said that the din of battle and the clash of swords had prevented him from hearing the word of the law clearly. But the voices of opposition were few and far between. Rome had stood on the brink of absolute destruction, and Marius had delivered them a stunning victory. When he returned to Rome, people tripped over themselves to praise him and offer him rewards. He was declared the 3rd founder of Rome and pronounced Saviour of the city. The story of the defence of Italy against the Cimbri and the Teutones is the story of the invention of the true Roman legion. Centuries in the making, the Roman soldier had finally evolved into its strongest form, the classic legions of the High Empire, the well-provisioned, the disciplined, the dedicated, the professional, part engineer, part mule, part warrior. And this professional army would set such an example that for the next 2,000 years, the militaries of 100 different states would all aspire to become the new legions. But, as it had always been the case in Roman history, every change that the legions made to solve a problem created 2 more. Although this kind of new model army had saved the Roman Republic from the invading barbarians, it would also be one of the key reasons that it would tear itself apart from within. And it all started with the guy who was at the very center of all of this, Gaius Marius, the man who contributed the most to these new legions. We've been following in this video mostly the narrative of Plutarch, whose account is the most detailed, and he credits Marius with many of the reforms that would turn Rome's army into a professional force. And it seems the Romans themselves, when looking to a founder for their professional army, tended to name Gaius Marius as being that guy. The reality, of course, is probably much more complicated. Most of Marius's reforms can probably just be considered the widespread implementation of pre-existing ideas. For example, although Marius was the guy who finally did away with wealth requirements for military service, the Senate had been gradually lowering the bar on who could and who couldn't serve in the military for the last few decades, because they'd been dealing with a manpower shortage since the 130s. Nevertheless, even though Marius definitely didn't completely reinvent the legions all by himself, he certainly changed them in a number of very, very important ways, and the most long-lasting impact he had was to change the relationship between soldiers, their generals, and the Roman state. The majority of soldiers were now no longer propertied, land-owning men who fought to defend what they had. They were largely landless, poor people who fought to acquire these things, not to defend them. And the way that they acquired them was through their generals and their commanders, not through the state. Their generals were the ones who paid them. Their generals would be the ones with whom they would negotiate their retirement packages, and their generals would often maintain the loyalty of these men by promising to fight for their political interests. And all of this came at a time when the Roman nobility were increasingly at each other's throats, and the Senate was declining in popularity. When Marius said that the din and noise of battle prevented him from hearing the word of the law clearly, that resonated with a great deal of Roman officers, who would go on to say things like, "Do not quote laws to men who have swords." A brief glance at this timeline of Republican history will show us the true consequences of Marius's reforms. Prior to Gaius Marius, the worst internal political violence in Roman history, at least recently, were the murders of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, a terrible and tragic event in which hundreds died. In the century after, Rome would suffer multiple horrendous civil wars, leaving a death toll in the tens, if not the hundreds of thousands. Legion would fight against legion, as this new military system made centralization of power around a single individual easier to achieve, and the law less effective. In the end, the Republic would fall into the hands of basically just military dictators, whose true source of power came from the command and loyalty of the legions, not from the law of the Roman people. And these civil wars would begin with Marius himself. After all, he had been the most powerful man in Rome for years on end. He'd been proclaimed the savior of the Roman people and the third founder of Rome. And he had tens of thousands of adoring veterans who would take up the sword again in a heartbeat if only he asked them to. How does a man like that ever retire? But all of that is for the next video, which I hope won't take as long as this one did to make, in which we will properly introduce Marius's greatest enemy, Sulla, and talk about the story of how they tore Rome apart between them. But that's all for next time, and I'll see you then, I suppose. Thank you all for watching.